well-known fact that almost all music is composed of a combination of scales and arpeggios. But did you know that ascending scales are actually easier than descending scales? Hello to my nearly 2,000 fellow instrumentalists who already subscribe to the channel, and hi to the rest of you who don't. I'm Jacques Gadway, and this is Gadway Violin. In today's video, we're going to talk about descending scales. The topic of today's video actually came from the comments, so if there's a topic of violin that you'd like me to make a video about, be sure to leave it in the comments below. Descending scales are difficult on the violin, and one of the things that's the most frustrating about them is that they kind of grow with you as you progress in your violin playing. Essentially, as you get better at the instrument, descending scales get more difficult. I don't mean that the same scale gets harder and harder, but rather as you progress, you get access to more difficult repertoire that requires new things from your technique. And the descending scale is definitely one of those techniques that continues to progress in its complexity. So in today's video, we're going to go over 4 levels of violin playing and talk about the corresponding difficulties that we will discover in descending scales. Of course, we're not just going to talk about these difficulties, we're going to address them so that you can overcome these obstacles in your practice. So let's start from the beginning. What is difficult about descending scales for a beginner? For this first stage of descending scales, the beginner stage, let's take the 2-octave G major scale. We're just going to take the descending section of that scale, so we're going to start at the very top note, that G on the E string, and we're going to descend from there. Now, one of the things that's challenging at this stage of violin playing is that because the repertoire we're playing is not all that complicated, it's quite possible to play things without executing them with the proper technique. In the case of the descending scale, this is definitely apparent. If we play a descending scale in G major, it's quite possible we can play all of the notes, and we can do so with potentially bad techniques. One such technique that I want you to look out for, and really the most important thing to develop at this stage, is the idea of preparing multiple fingers at once. This means when you start at the very beginning of the scale, you should have not just your second finger down, but your first finger as well. Essentially, a rule of thumb that I want you to think about when you're playing your descending scales from this stage and beyond is to think about greatly simplifying the movement required to create each note. To put it simply, our ideal scenario during our descending scale is that when we create a note, we do so exclusively by lifting a finger. Let's demonstrate this idea. When we create our F sharp after the G, we're going to do so by simply lifting the second finger. This works only because the first finger was already down in the correct place. This might sound simple, but the concept gets more complicated as we add in other fingers. This is why I believe, even at this stage, it's important to use your fourth fingers on the descent. Because in doing so, if we make sure to use this technique, then we can already build these really good habits. So for example, instead of playing an open E on this descending scale, we're going to play a fourth finger on the A string. And though, as you can see, it's quite possible to play the fourth finger without having the third finger down, if we don't place the third finger down, then in order to play the D after the E, we would have to do 2 motions. We'd have to lift the fourth finger and place the third finger. This is a clunky movement. It's not quite ergonomic, and it's going to lead to a slowed response from our fingers. Once again, it's totally possible for us to pull this off and to place our fingers while lifting them. In other words, doing multiple movements at once in order to create the note that we've desired. However, just because it's possible doesn't mean it's right, because we're not looking for a technique that allows us to do just this. What we're looking to do in our practice of especially our scales is build techniques from which we can create good foundations and build upon. And one of the most important fundamental techniques we can build on by using descending scales is the idea of preparing multiple fingers at once. This means, in the case of the fourth finger, we need to at the very least not just place the fourth finger, but place the third finger as well. Ideally, eventually we get to a point where we can place the fourth, third, and second, and then maybe the fourth, third, second, and first. One very important caveat to this idea is that although I'm saying to prepare multiple fingers at once, I don't mean that you should be gripping the neck of the instrument. So be careful of placing all of your fingers and having a lot of excess tension. That is one of the primary dangers of executing this technique. Instead, think about placing your fingers in the correct place, not with some amount of pressure. Remember, the only finger that really needs to press the string down is the finger that we're using. In the case of having the fourth finger down, sounding that E natural, we're going to just need that fourth finger to stop the string. Your other fingers can help, but understand that every bit of pressure that they're adding to the string is less pressure that the fourth finger needs to add itself. So think of the amount of force necessary to stop the string and divide that by what fingers you're placing on the string. But understand that it's not going to be a perfect match. If you have four fingers down, you're not going to split the weight of them 25% on each. Rather, you're likely going to have most of your force on the finger that's actually being sounded to ensure that it's stopping the string, and then the rest of the force weighted towards the lower finger. So when I'm playing my descending scales and I get to that fourth finger, because I'm coming from a first finger on the E string, I'm actually not going to lift my first finger and bring it over to the A just yet. I'm simply going to keep it on the E and place what fingers I can on the A, with a primary focus of having my third finger prepared. Once we play the third finger, we can again prepare the first finger. Essentially, we're always thinking ahead of what fingers we will need, so that when it's time to play a finger, it's already there. One of the really difficult things about this is that it's not just about placing the fingers on the string, it's about placing them in the correct place. In the G major scale, for example, we know that we have low twos on the E and A string, but we also know that we have F sharp on the D string, which means that we need that second finger to be prepared early in a high position. So again, the main takeaway from this beginner exercise is to remember that even though it's possible to play the scale at the tempo you're playing it without doing the proper technique, doesn't mean it's okay. Remember, the purpose of practicing these scales is to develop good foundations for which you can build more advanced techniques upon. Once you've gotten this beginner level really solidified, it's possible you're ready for the intermediate level. As you get better at the violin, you start to move away from just one position, and you start to shift around. And so the next difficulty with our descending scales is, of course, shifting. As we shift upwards while we have an ascending scale, it's actually quite easy for our body to do. We're going to take the D major 2-octave scale starting in first position and use it as an example for the difference in difficulty between shifting up and shifting down. So let's just break down what happens when we shift up versus what happens when we shift down. When we're shifting up in this scale, we're going from a C sharp to a D natural. Second finger to first finger. C sharp to D natural. And we benefit from the fact that the finger we're shifting to is a lower finger. So we're shifting from a higher finger to a lower finger. And in doing so, our arrival is actually going to be more related to our hand frame. Think about what you're doing when you're shifting. You're not just moving a finger up into a new position. Rather, you're changing positions, and what that means is you're changing where your hand is placed. And if you're a subscriber to this channel, you likely already know that I like to define my hand position by understanding what my double contact is in that position. And for me personally, in the case of first position and third position, my double contact is essentially identical, just in a different place on the fingerboard. But more importantly to note is that, if you recall from previous videos, I like to think of my thumb as being placed across from where that first finger naturally wants to land. Which means if we're shifting to a first finger, we get to benefit from our double contact in terms of it giving us a real sense of a frame of reference. Let's take a look at the descending scale and see how we do not benefit from this nearly as much. On the descending scale, we're going to shift from a first finger D to a second finger C sharp, which means that our double contact, our thumb, in other words, is going to move past where our finger will end up. It's going to move such that we're in first position, and then we have to place a second finger. And our second finger is being related to our first finger, which is related to our double contact. So our new note, in other words, is a little bit more removed in terms of our frames of reference. It's not as directly known. This simple fact makes descending shifts all the more difficult. Imagine now that we shift from a first finger all the way down to a fourth finger. It can really get intense, the difference between how far our hand shifts down and how far our desired pitch is from the base of that double contact, or from the thumb of that double contact. Remember that our double contact is essentially our frame of reference. So you might be hearing this and think, okay, so what's the solution? Well, there's two solutions. The first is potentially the most obvious, and that's to really, really well understand your relationship between all of your fingers and your double contact. If you have a super solid grasp of where your second finger should be related to your double contact, or in other words, your hand position, then so long as you get your hand positioned to the right place, you know that your C sharp is going to be in tune. However, there's another way to create some frame of reference for your desired pitch that goes beyond the idea of your position. This is a concept I've actually made a video about before that I like to call ghost notes. Essentially, the idea behind it is that we take our departure note, in this case our D natural, this is the note we play right before the shift, and while we shift, we try our best to conjure up a memory of that finger. In other words, a ghost of it that'll be right here. And then when we shift down, we place our second finger not only related to the double contact, but also related to the ghost of the previous finger. So we create two frames of reference, one being that it's a half step lower than our departure pitch, another being that it's a whole step above our double contact and first finger. When we give ourselves yet another frame of reference, it makes our shift all the more easier. Alright, so you're advancing as a violinist. You've mastered the idea of the downshift, the double frames of reference, the double contact, and the ghost note, the departure note. What's next? How can it get more difficult? Well, as we progress in violin playing, we continue to expand our knowledge of positions, and we go beyond third position. For most violinists, around fourth position, something happens to the hand. For me personally, it's right around third position and beyond, right around 3.5 position, I like to say. It's at this point that for me personally, my double contact has to change. Because of the size of my hand and the way that I have my violin set up, right around 3.5 position, my palm runs into the body of the instrument. And when this happens, if we count our points of contact, we can see that we violate our rule of double contact. We have our palm touching, that's 1. We have, of course, the natural index and the thumb, that's 2 and 3. That's 3 points of contact. Anything more than 2 points of contact is going to cause our hand to lock up and make it so that we lose dexterity in our fingers. So something's got to give. The solution that is widely accepted is that we release our index contact point, we maintain our thumb, and the new 2 points of contact are the thumb, like it always has been, and now some point on the palm touching the body of the instrument. So we've retained the rule. Double contact continues to prevail, just with a different combination. Now, with this new idea in mind, we can see that there are some new difficulties that can arise with our descending scales. These difficulties are actually going to apply to both ascending and descending scales, but we're just going to come at it from one of the directions because this video is just about descending scales. By the way, the area on the fingerboard where your hand switches from one double contact to another is often referred to as no man's land. And this is because for most of us, myself included, there's a period of the fingerboard, in my case around 3.5 to 4th position, where we can actually play pretty comfortable with either form of double contact, either with our thumb and index joint or with our thumb and palm making contact. But let's talk about descending scales that transition from one point of contact to another and express why this is difficult and, potentially, how to overcome this obstacle. For this concept, let's take the C major scale. We're going to take the C major 3-octave scale, and we're going to start from the very top using what I consider to be a pretty standard fingering. This is one where we use a 4/4 at the top. If you know, you know. If not, don't worry, I'll have the music right here on the bottom of the screen with the fingerings as well. So with these fingerings, we're going to only do 2 shifts on the way down. They're going to be larger shifts than we did previously. In this case, we're shifting from a first finger to a third finger in both shifts. We're starting in 8th position. And there we see the first shift, and in turn, the first difficulty at this level. The difficulty isn't just in transitioning double contacts. Really, it's more about in transitioning with severe differences in hand positions. You see, as we get into these high positions, like 8th position, you see that the further we get down the fingerboard, the more of a problem the body of the instrument becomes. As we get closer to it, our palm runs into it, and then it starts to need to come around, and come around, and come around. One mistake that I often see advanced students make is that they overcompensate for getting around the instrument. And it results in them having these really high fingers coming at really extreme angles. Sometimes it's so extreme, and you might notice this in your own playing, that their fingers almost come from this left side of the string and pull the string to the right. This is not good. We don't want to pull the string away to the side. We always want our fingers to be giving action, pushing the strings down in an ergonomic fashion. So the big concept and technique that we want to address and practice and work on at this level of violin playing is that we need to understand that as we play in these higher positions and we change to that palm contact, that the whole objective of where we place our hand should be predicated on our desired outcome. And our desired outcome should be that we want our fingers to have a consistent shape and height. What shape and what height should that be? Well, that's been defined and created from the beginning of our scale journey. As a beginner, we developed these good habits in our descending scales. And as an intermediate, we continued to reinforce them. As an advanced player, we should continue to build upon these ideas. Let's take a quick look back at what a beginner should be doing in their scales. They should be playing in first position, of course, but remember, they should be placing those 4th fingers and as many fingers as they can in early preparation during those descents. And whatever the shape of your fingers are at this stage that we've decided are very agreeable, lead to comfort and agility and consistency in intonation, are the shapes that we should be attempting to maintain regardless of the position. In 3rd position, we want to see the same shape. In 4th position, we run into the instrument and we still maintain the shape. In 5th position, we go a little higher and we still try to maintain that shape. In 6th position, in 7th, and in 8th. Notice the placement of my hand is getting slightly further away from the instrument, but it's not completely going underneath. It's also not coming up so high that the angle or the shape of these fingers changes drastically. I'm informing where my hand needs to be based off of where I'd like my fingers to be. So, in other words, how much you must come over the instrument is dependent on what shape you'd like to see in your fingers. Understand that this is a concept and that in reality your hands will change in shape somewhat, but the attempt to maintain is going to be a clear objective that can inform your decisions. At the end of the day, we are going to be limited to our physicality. If your hand's really small, it might have to come over more than mine does. If your hand's really large, it might be able to stay even further back, and it might be comfortable to have longer fingers. Even for me, when I get to a high enough position, there really is no denying it, my fourth and third fingers start to straighten out slightly. But the longer you can maintain the most consistent shape of those fingers, the better. So when you're repositioning your hands during these shifts, you should be doing so changing from position to position in such a way that maintains as much as possible those finger shapes. So we don't want to go from something drastic like this all the way down here. We're not concerned about the hand, we're concerned about the fingers. How do they look? Do they look really curled up here and then really flat down here, or vice versa? Usually what I see is students will either be really flat in the higher positions, or they'll be way too curled. But you want to find that neutral zone where your fingers look very natural. You might be surprised to find how low your palm rests relative to the body of the instrument in order to create the most comfortable shape in your fingers. So, as you advance in violin playing, notice that we add new difficulties and new techniques to each of these descending scales as the repertoire expands, and so do our techniques. But every step of the way, we use the previous technique, the previous foundation, to build upon. Even though we're now in the stratosphere in 8th, 9th position, we still are thinking about preparing multiple fingers like we did when we were beginners. We're still thinking about shifting with our double contact and using multiple frames of reference like we did when we were intermediate. And now we've practiced these advanced techniques for long enough and we're ready to hit the road as a professional musician. And here is where all of our techniques culminate into the most complicated idea for descending scales. This is the fourth and final level of descending scales. It's at this point where we're going to address that sometimes in repertoire, we have to play scales that are so fast and so clean that we want to have no portamento and essentially have it sound like no shift even ever occurred. There is an innate problem with playing very quickly during a descending scale that requires shifting, and that's that the distance of the shift cannot be ignored. Remember that when we shift, we're not just playing one finger to another, we're actually changing from one position to another, which means that whatever your fingering is tells us pretty easily how far your hand has to shift. And if you're playing a very, very fast passage, where you're playing 16th notes at 150 BPMs, then you know you're going to be playing 600 notes per minute. You might even play faster than that. But let's take the 600 notes per minute as an example. If you were to play 600 notes per minute, and you're supposed to shift in between two of those notes, that would mean in the span between two notes moving that fast, you'd have to move the distance of that shift. Let's take that C major scale again and look at how far the shift is and determine how fast our hand would need to shift in order for it to sound cleanly at 600 notes per minute. If we play this C major scale downwards, we're shifting from 8th position down to 5th. That means that our first finger is going to end up around here somewhere, whereas it started here. That means that the distance is this far between that first and fourth finger. Roughly that far between two notes moving 600 notes per minute. That's actually a very far distance for our hand to move in such a short period of time. So how do we reconcile this? And how do we accomplish the shift in such a way that it doesn't really sound like we shifted at all? No, seriously, how do we do it? Well, I'll tell you my solution. When you get to the higher levels of violin playing, we take all of these really clear rules and techniques and we start to manipulate them and put them into each other in ways that we previously said we probably shouldn't do. It's important, therefore, to not move on to this step until you're certain that the other steps are extremely well ironed out. You want to have crystal clear foundations before you start manipulating them too much in order to do these more advanced and complicated techniques. So what is this advanced and complicated technique that we're talking about? Well, we're talking specifically about something that Galamian called the box shift. Well, a version of it, at least. We're going to, instead of shift from one note to another, move in a couple of steps. Let's take that descending scale again. Instead of moving right away from 8th position to 5th position, we're going to actually compromise the shape of our hand, something that we typically don't do while we shift. In the most fundamental of shifts, we want to maintain our hand shape and our finger shape as best as we can as we execute the shift. However, in a fast, subtle, fluid box shift, we're going to do quite the opposite. We're going to actually move our third finger in this case as close to our first finger as we can. We're going to compress, deform the hand. And essentially, we're going to try and focus on our finger replacing that first finger. It's not just going to replace it, it's going to actually replace it and then move down a half step. And only after that motion happens do we follow up the hand with the remainder of the shift. It's kind of confusing, it's definitely complicated, but in some extreme circumstances, it can be very useful. All that being said, I personally rarely whip out this technique. It is not something that you commonly would need to do. It's only for extreme scenarios where you either need to really hide the sound of a portamento or you need to shift extremely quickly. In fact, I can pretty much remember the last time that I used this technique in a genuine setting. The last time I used it, Max Brooks' Scottish Fantasy. In the last movement of that piece, there are some crazy fast arpeggios and scales and runs, and in order to play them, you really did have to manipulate your hand in such a fashion. If you have no interest in playing this level of virtuosic pieces, which honestly these days I really don't, you don't really need to do this much at all. You can go on living a perfectly fulfilling life just worrying about the first 3 ideas in this video, or just the first one. Whatever's suitable for your journey, I encourage you to practice and take to heart. With that, please like this video and leave a comment below if there's a concept of violin playing you'd like me to cover. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a future video, and like always, happy practicing.